In 1979, everything changed. The hidden alliance dissolved, the embassies emptied, and decades of cooperation were cast as betrayal. But the revolution didn't just redraw alliances, it rewrote identity. Iran's new regime saw Zionism not as foreign policy, but as blasphemy. Jews became suspects. Synagogues stood silent. Executions followed rumors. And what had once been the oldest continuous Jewish community outside Israel began to vanish. This is how ideology can turn neighbors into threats and force a people to disappear quietly or die loudly. Start.
Imagine a country, a really significant regional player, basically flipping its entire identity almost overnight.
It's quite something to picture.
So 1 minute, it's this monarchy, a quiet partner to the West, even somewhat aligned with Israel behind the scenes.
Yeah, the Pahlavi dynasty.
And then boom, it's a revolutionary republic actively calling for the export of its ideology and positioning itself as this, fierce global adversary.
It's a drama, really, packed with these incredibly profound human stories, but also these huge geopolitical shifts that we're still feeling the echoes of today very powerfully.
That's what we're diving into. Iran, specifically that really turbulent decade right after the 1979 Islamic Revolution. We're focusing squarely on, say, 1979 through 1990.
And it wasn't just, a change of government. This was genuinely a watershed era. It didn't just alter Iran internally, though it certainly did that. Completely reshaped the dynamics of the Middle East.
Totally redefined its relationship with the rest of the world.
Especially, perhaps most dramatically, with Israel and the West. That relationship just inverted.
So to help us navigate this incredibly complex transformation, we've gathered a whole stack of source materials. We've got research, reports, historical accounts, and together they paint a pretty detailed picture of this period.
Yeah, and these sources, they explore several areas, don't they?
They do. Things like the strategic and symbolic shift the new regime enacted almost immediately.
The really intense, almost total ideological reversal, particularly towards Israel.
Yeah, and the deep impact all this had on Iran's own domestic structures, especially its intelligence apparatus.
Right, the collapse of Savak and all that. And then there's how the West really struggled, frankly, to understand and even respond to this new Iran.
A lot of misreading there, it seems.
Definitely. And finally, the unexpected birth and, the rapid development of Iran's strategy of proxy warfare, something quite new for them.
So we want to move beyond just listing facts,
Yeah, get to the insight.
Extract those really important insights, those aha moments maybe, that help us understand not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did.
And how this turbulent decade wasn't just a blip, but actively constructed the foundations for so many of the dynamics, the tensions we're still seeing play out today, regionally and globally.
It's really a journey into understanding the roots of the present, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so settle in, because we're about to take a really deep dive into how Iran fundamentally transformed itself between 1979 and 1990, guided by these source materials. Let's get started.
Great. Where do we begin?
Well, our first section really gets into how this new regime in Iran presented itself, both to its own people and importantly to the world.
Right. The messaging.
Yeah, we're looking at the incredibly potent use of symbolism and also that complete overhaul of Iran's core ideology, especially its new stance towards Israel.
Given the history, yeah.
Our sources here, particularly excerpts titled Symbolism and Messaging and the Ideological Reversal, they really show just how rapid and fundamental this change actually was.
And symbolism, it just became this primary tool, didn't it? Deployed strategically right from the get-go, February 1979.
How so?
Well, you see the old iconography, everything associated with the Shah's monarchy, it was systematically dismantled, just wiped away.
Replaced with what?
Replaced by these powerful religious and revolutionary images. You saw it everywhere. Murals covering city walls, banners in mass rallies, even soldiers, right, who were previously loyal to the Shah, suddenly they're carrying posters of Ayatollah Khomeini.
So not just window dressing, this was deep.
No, not at all. It was this visual, pervasive assertion of the new leadership's legitimacy, a declaration of its radically different identity everywhere you look.
Like a total rebranding almost,
Yeah.
designed to reach everyone.
Precisely. And what's really fascinating, I think, is how the new regime so masterfully fused religious and political messaging. They used these new symbols, this potent rhetoric, to assert a revolutionary identity that was, simultaneously deeply rooted in Islamic principles, but also fiercely defiant. Defiant of both internal enemies, remnants of the old regime, and external enemies.
For consolidating power at home, I imagine.
Hugely. Mobilizing the population, but also for projecting their unique identity onto the international stage.
And their goal wasn't just internal transformation, was it? It was about projecting this outwards.
The strategy was explicit. Disseminate this ideological symbolism regionally, globally. Iran aimed to project its revolutionary identity as, well, both a successful model for change and an inspiration for others.
Particularly other Muslim communities.
Yes, especially those they perceived as oppressed under Western influence or tyrannical rule. They weren't just transforming Iran. They saw themselves positioning it as the vanguard of a new kind of pan-Islamic movement.
Announcing themselves as this new ideologically charged force on the world stage.
With a seemingly universal message, yeah. Liberation from perceived Western dominance and local tyranny.
And nowhere was this ideological shift more dramatic, maybe more considering the history, than in Iran's relationship with Israel. That source, the ideological reversal, really drills down into this.
It's a truly radical reversal. I mean, you have to remember, for decades under the Shah, Iran and Israel actually maintained this covert de facto alliance.
Right, part of Israel's periphery doctrine.
That strategy of building relationships with non-Arab states or minorities on the edges of the Arab world. And by the 1970s, this cooperation was extensive. It spanned military, economic, and particularly intelligence spheres.
Iran even recognized Israel quite early on, didn't they?
Informally, yes.
Right.
They were the second Muslim-majority country after Turkey to grant recognition way back in 1950.
And then the revolution hits and everything just flips.
Completely. Instantly. Khomeini's worldview was fundamentally defined by this, well, uncompromising, almost existential hostility towards Zionism in Israel.
Not just a political disagreement.
No, far beyond that. He didn't just see Israel as a political adversary or, a foreign policy issue. He framed it within this cosmic struggle, a struggle between Islam and falsehood, basically. He saw Israel as this malevolent force, intrinsically linked to all forms of oppression.
Including Iran's own suffering under the Shah.
Yes, whom he constantly accused of being a puppet of foreign powers. His famous labeling, the U.S. as the great Satan and Israel as the little Satan.
That wasn't just rhetoric.
It was an ideological framework. It linked the two as primary, almost indivisible enemies in this grand struggle.
And he actually used this anti-Zionist rhetoric during the revolution itself to rally people.
Oh, it was a potent tool for mobilization. He claimed, for instance, that Israeli agents were behind alleged massacres of protesters during the Shah's final desperate crackdowns.
Which painted the Shah's regime
as not just corrupt, but as a mere instrument of Israel in the West, part of that larger struggle. It was a powerful way to rally popular support and, frankly, delegitimize the old order entirely.
And the language he used about Israel, it was incredibly harsh.
Uncompromising, inflammatory. That became the standard. He consistently denied Israel's legitimacy, right? Never referred to it by name, always the Zionist regime, the usurping Israeli regime.
And the cancerous tumor analogy.
Famously compared Israel to a cancerous tumor in the heart of the Middle East, whose defeat and eradication were presented as this necessary, almost surgical imperative.
So, no room for negotiation, coexistence.
Zero. The only acceptable outcome in this view was the state's complete removal. This absolutist stance, it was partly intended, to position Iran as the vanguard of resistance against Israel, to unify the Muslim world under Tehran's ideological banner.
And this wasn't just talk. Between 79 and 90, they took concrete, systematic steps to really institutionalize this anti-Zionist stance.
The speed and totality of the break are just striking when you look at the timeline. February 1979, immediately upon the revolution's triumph, all formal relations severed, cut.
The Israeli diplomatic mission in Tehran.
Summarily closed. And then, in this moment, just thick with symbolism, PLO leader Yasser Arafat is invited as the first foreign dignitary to visit the new Islamic Republic.
And the embassy building.
The former Israeli embassy compound wasn't just closed, it was handed over, lock, stock, and barrel to the PLO to establish a Palestinian mission right there.
Wow.
And Khomeini reportedly told Arafat that Iran's revolution would remain incomplete until Palestine was liberated. That really solidified this deep ideological bond.
And the break went far beyond just diplomacy.
Oh, completely. It was comprehensive. They severed all diplomatic and trade ties. This included immediately halting oil exports to Israel.
Which had been significant under the Shah, ironically.
Hugely significant, yes. A major supplier. They nullified pipeline access agreements, canceled all outstanding contracts with Israeli firms, decades of covert alliance, economic partnership gone in one swift, decisive stroke.
And those security and intelligence ties we mentioned earlier, they were also dismantled.
That extensive covert cooperation, particularly between Savak, the Shah's notorious secret police,
which Mossad had helped set up.
Right. Mossad played a key role in establishing Savak and training its agents back in the 50s and 60s. That collaboration was stopped cold. Savak itself was formally disbanded, a symbol of the old regime's repression. And the new authorities actually made a point of exposing prior security ties, using it to discredit the former government.
And the old Israeli mission.
Publicly labeled an espionage center, joint military projects, like that secret Project Flower missile development deal signed in '77,
where Iran was trading oil for Israeli missile tech.
That was abruptly terminated. Israeli military personnel, technical advisors, expelled from the country, gone.
And this is the context then for establishing Quds Day.
Yes, it's a really key piece of how this anti-Zionism was institutionalized, made permanent. In August 1979, just months after the revolution, Khomeini declared the last Friday of Ramadan as International Al-Quds Day, Jerusalem Day.
Calling for global protests.
Global rallies, demonstrations, protesting Israel's control over Jerusalem. He framed it as a religious duty for all Muslims. A unifying protest of the oppressed against the oppressors, specifically highlighting the Palestinian struggle as the prime example of this cosmic conflict.
And it became an annual event.
A major fixture in the Iranian calendar, yeah. Sending a clear signal. This break with Israel wasn't just political or tactical. It was deeply ideological, meant to be irreversible, and designed to serve as a rallying point for the broader Islamic world. Iran was explicitly positioning itself as the leader of global resistance against Israel.
Then, in September 1980, the Iran-Iraq War breaks out. An existential threat to the new regime. Did that soften the stance towards Israel, even pragmatically?
Publicly, not one bit. Despite being regionally isolated, facing a massive invasion, Iran publicly refused to seek any form of Israeli assistance. Tehran kept up the fiery rhetoric, denouncing peace deals like Camp David. Their public stance remained absolute hostility.
But then comes this really stunning twist of irony documented in the sources. Covert arms deals start happening between Iran and Israel, starting late 1980. How on earth is that possible amidst such absolute declared enmity?
It is one of the most paradoxical, debated aspects of this whole period. It really reveals the complex dance between ideology and, well, raw pragmatic need during wartime.
They needed weapons.
Desperately, spare parts, ammunition for their largely U.S.-made military arsenal, which was just getting chewed up in the brutal war with Iraq. So Tehran began engaging in these secret dealings with, of all countries, Israel.
When was the first major deal?
The sources point to October 1980. Israel quietly sells Iran tires for its F-4 Phantom fighter jets, crucially routed via a third country, France, to maintain deniability.
And this was while the American hostages were still being held.
A detail that reportedly alarmed the Carter administration. They apparently pressured Israel to halt the shipments.
So Israel stopped.
Temporarily. But almost immediately after the American hostages were freed in January 1981, Israel resumed covert arms exports to Iran. Now, with the tacit approval of the incoming Reagan administration.
Why would Reagan approve?
Israeli leaders, particularly the intelligence community, successfully argued that Saddam Hussein's Iraq was a more immediate, potent, conventional threat than Khomeini's revolutionary Iran, which they believed they could contain long-term.
Keep Iran in the fight against Iraq.
Essentially, yeah. Keep Iran strong enough to tie Iraq down in a costly war. So shipments surged in 81 and 82. Vital spare parts for Iran's F-4s, Chieftain tanks, HAWK missiles, often routed through complex networks involving European countries.
How big were these deals?
Estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars annually during their peak. There was reportedly even a covert office run by Israeli intelligence in New York, specifically to facilitate procuring U.S.-made arms for Iran.
That's just incredible. A covert Israeli intel office in New York buying U.S. weapons for a country publicly calling for Israel's destruction, and that had just held U.S. hostages.
It really underscores the strange, pragmatic, almost unbelievable alliances forged in the shadows of the Iran-Iraq War. But this couldn't stay secret forever.
Leaks happened.
Press leaks in March 1982 exposed some of these dealings, caused alarm in the Reagan administration, which then formally rescinded its tacit consent. But
Israel continued.
according to the sources, yes. Israel largely continued deliveries into the mid-1980s. Washington, maybe focused elsewhere, largely overlooked it or tolerated it.
Okay, let's just quickly recap this striking paradox we've just discussed.
Yeah, it's worth pausing on.
You've got Iran establishing this absolute, public, ideologically driven anti-Israel policy, severing all ties, symbolic acts like Quds Day.
Total public rejection.
But simultaneously, driven by the desperate pragmatic need for arms during the war with Iraq, they engage in these secret, extensive arms deals with Israel.
Right. It really highlights those complex, sometimes contradictory realities simmering just beneath the surface of the overt ideological conflict. Ideology set the direction, but wartime necessity created these bizarre back channels.
So while the public face was absolute hostility, no contact, this secret channel existed. And the conflict, the Iran-Iraq War, also started to manifest through proxies, didn't it? Particularly in Lebanon.
It did, significantly. June 1982, Israel invades southern Lebanon. Their stated goal is rooting out the PLO infrastructure there.
And Iran saw an opportunity.
Khomeini's Iran saw this chaos as a prime opportunity, a chance to export its revolution, champion Lebanon's marginalized Shiite community, and crucially strike directly at Israel and Western interests through an indigenous movement.
So they acted fast.
Swiftly. Within weeks of the invasion, Tehran dispatches, estimates vary, maybe 1,000 to 1,500 personnel from the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, their advisors and trainers, into Lebanon's eastern Bekaa Valley.
And IRGC was key here. It wasn't the regular army.
No. The IRGC, created by Khomeini shortly after the revolution, was designed as this ideological army, parallel to the regular military, the Artesh, tasked specifically with defending the revolution at home and spreading it abroad.
So these weren't just military advisors showing up in Lebanon.
Not at all. They were ideological cadres, first and foremost. Operating under Syrian auspices, Syria controlled that part of Lebanon. These IRGC units set up base camps. They started recruiting, indoctrinating, and giving paramilitary training to young Lebanese Shiite fighters.
Where do these recruits come from?
Many came from existing groups like the more secular ML movement, but they were looking for something more, a more explicitly Islamic, more revolutionary path. And over the next few years, this IRGC-guided force, it coalesced into what became known as Hezbollah.
Party of God.
Formally founded around 82-83, though they didn't publicly announce themselves until 1985.
And the sources are clear. Armed, trained, funded by Iran from day one.
Explicitly. The IRGC provided not just weapons and sophisticated ones over time and advanced paramilitary training, guerrilla tactics, explosives, urban warfare, but crucially intense ideological mentorship, grounded in Khomeini's specific brand of Shiite Islamism.
There's a quote, isn't there, from an IRGC commander?
Yeah, saying something like, the Muslims of Lebanon, especially the Shiites of Lebanese Hezbollah, consider themselves the offspring of the Islamic Revolution, really underscores that deep foundational connection.
And Hezbollah's loyalty was explicitly tied back to Tehran, structurally.
Yes. Their 1985 manifesto, the one announcing their existence, it explicitly pledges allegiance to Iran's supreme leader Khomeini at the time and to the principle of velayat-e-faqih,
the rule of the Islamic jurist.
the foundational doctrine of the Islamic Republic itself. This doctrine essentially bound their loyalty constitutionally, ideologically to Tehran. Some analysis in the sources really questions if Hezbollah could have even emerged in the form it did, or maybe at all, without this direct, deep Iranian sponsorship.
And then the IRGC's specialized units, the Quds Force precursor, they channeled the support.
They were the primary conduit, funneling millions of dollars, vast shipments of arms to Hezbollah, even while Iran itself was bleeding in the war with Iraq.
And Hezbollah quickly became notorious, using Iran's proxy strategy to carry out these, well, spectacular attacks.
They did, often initially operating under the cover name Islamic Jihad Organization to obscure the direct link. But the campaign of high-impact terror attacks started swiftly. April 1983, the suicide bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, 63 killed, 17 Americans among them.
And then the barracks bombings?
Just 6 months later, October 1983, those two massive truck bombs hitting the barracks of the U.S. Marine contingent, 241 personnel killed, and the French paratroopers, 58 killed. They were part of that multinational peacekeeping force.
The deadliest attack on U.S. forces up to that point.
By far.
And intelligence quickly linked these attacks back to Iran-supported Hezbollah.
U.S. and French intelligence services did, yes. Declassified intelligence reports cited in our sources indicate these 1983 bombings were carried out at Tehran's explicit command.
Explicit command.
Apparently, U.S. signals intelligence intercepted an Iranian directive weeks before the Marine barracks bombing, instructing their Lebanese operatives to take action, interpreted as a direct order.
And the attacks didn't stop there.
No, the campaign continued. Another bombing, this time of the U.S. Embassy annex. Kidnapping of numerous Western hostages throughout the decade in Beirut. And some sources indicate hostages were sometimes held in Iran or under direct IRGC supervision, further underscoring Tehran's hands-on role.
What were the main objectives Iran achieved through these early Hezbollah attacks? What was the payoff?
Well, multiple objectives were served. Tactically, these high-casualty attacks were instrumental in achieving a major strategic goal.
Which was?
They significantly contributed to the decision by the U.S. and other Western nations to withdraw their peacekeeping forces from Beirut in early 1984. That was a huge win for Iran and Syria.
And strategically?
Strategically, they sent this incredibly clear signal. Iran, despite its conventional military limitations during the war, could strike its adversaries asymmetrically abroad. It could inflict significant pain, achieve outsized impact on Western policy, all with plausible deniability and minimal overt risk to Iran itself.
There's a CIA assessment mentioned.
Yeah, a 1987 CIA assessment noted that Iranian leaders viewed Hezbollah's successes in Beirut as tangible proof that terrorism can break U.S. resolve. And consequently, they saw sabotage and terrorism as an important option in their broader confrontation with the United States.
So proxy terrorism basically became validated as a potent foreign policy tool for Iran.
Hezbollah became this vital asset. It demonstrated that a loyal, well-trained foreign militia could act as a force multiplier, bridging geographic divides, serving Iran's strategic objectives. And this wasn't just, cold pragmatism. It really emerged from the core ideology of the revolution itself.
Right. Back to Khomeini's call to export our revolution.
Khomeini genuinely believed the revolution had this universal pan-Islamic message. Iran should not remain in an enclosed environment, he said. The Constitution itself mandates support for the continuation of the revolution at home and abroad, paving the way for the unity of the world Islamic community.
The religious duty, almost.
Framed that way, yes. A duty to confront perceived tyrannies, globally regional monarchies, the superpowers, and champion Islamic movements wherever they arose. And that neither East nor West ethos of the revolution also supported using unconventional, asymmetrical means against the established global order.
Early leaders were quite open about this export idea.
Yeah. Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, Iran's first post-revolution president, openly stated that Iran's revolution will not win unless it is exported. It was baked in from the start.
Okay, let's just take a quick pause here. We've covered the emergence of this proxy strategy.
Right.
Iran's pivot, Hezbollah, as the key example, and how those early brutal attacks proved the effectiveness of this approach for projecting power and achieving goals, like driving Western forces out of Lebanon.
A strategy born from both ideology that export imperative and, as we'll see more, pragmatic necessity, using non-state actors when direct military power was weak or too risky.
Where ideology met strategic opportunity. So the state of Iran's regular military, the Artesh, you mentioned it was weak. That played a role in this turn towards proxies.
Yes, it was a really significant factor. The Shah's regular military, the Artesh, was severely weakened. You had post-revolution purges, executions of officers seen as loyal to the Shah, massive internal turmoil, and then sanctions cutting off spare parts for their largely Western equipment.
So their ability to project power conventionally was limited.
Severely limited, especially when facing Iraq's invasion, which had backing from various international players. Proxies, therefore, offered a pragmatic necessity. It was a way to act abroad, influence regional conflicts, blending that ideological zeal we talked about with a practical means to achieve goals when conventional power just wasn't there.
And the Iran-Iraq War, that grueling 8-year conflict, you said it was hardening this proxy doctrine.
The crucible. Saddam Hussein invaded in 1980 expecting a quick victory, right? Instead, it ground into this bloody, incredibly costly 8-year stalemate.
And Iran's military struggled.
They struggled immensely in conventional terms. It starkly highlighted the limits of their direct power projection capabilities against a well-armed adversary like Iraq. There's a CSIS analysis cited in the sources that calls the war a major turning point. It showed Iran's conventional units performed poorly, revealing that Iran's real comparative advantage wasn't in traditional warfare. It was in its ability to work with state and non-state actors, an irregular approach led by the IRGC.
So they actively cultivated proxy forces during the war itself. Not just Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Actively and intentionally, yes. They saw them as a force multiplier against Iraq, too. For instance, the IRGC provided sanctuary, arms, funding, training to Iraqi Shiite dissident groups operating against Saddam's regime from inside Iran.
Like SCRI and the Badr Brigade.
In 1982, the IRGC helped facilitate the formation of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, SCRI, and its armed wing, the Badr Brigade. Thousands of Iraqi Shiite volunteers were reportedly trained by the IRGC for guerrilla raids, intel gathering, operations inside Iraq.
Did they fight alongside Iranian forces?
Some did, yeah. They fought alongside IRGC troops on the front lines. Sources estimate that maybe up to 5,000 foreign Shia militants, mostly Iraqi, operating under IRGC command, were killed during the war.
And even if these proxies didn't win the war conventionally, they provided long-term strategic benefits for Iran.
They didn't turn the conventional tide against Iraq's army, but they kept Iraq off balance, tied down Iraqi resources. And crucially, they laid the groundwork for Iran's significant influence in Iraq decades later, after Saddam's fall.
So the war experience really validated the proxy model for Tehran.
Completely. It showed that building and supporting proxy militias could yield substantial long-term strategic dividends, often at a relatively low cost compared to direct military engagement, even while fighting an existential war at home.
And this model, this strategy, it expanded beyond just Lebanon and Iraq in the mid-1980s.
It became a truly regional strategy. Iran actively supported militant Shiite networks and tried to stir dissent among Shiite communities across the Arabian Gulf states. Remember, most of those states were backing Iraq in the war.
There was an early example in Bahrain.
Yes, December 1981. An attempted coup in Bahrain by the Iran-backed Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain, orchestrated with IRGC support. That was one of the earliest overt attempts to export the revolution via proxy groups beyond Iraq and Lebanon.
And they targeted Saudi Arabia and Kuwait as well.
Yes, notably trying to instigate unrest among the Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia's eastern province, and using the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca for political propaganda and agitation against the Saudi monarchy. That led to a deadly confrontation in 1987.
Aimed at undermining the Gulf monarchies.
Undermining rivals who supported Iraq. Iran also patronized clandestine groups like Hezbollah al-Hijaz in Saudi Arabia that emerged mid-80s, again with Iranian backing IRGC training, funding. They operated covertly across Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, carrying out terror attacks against Saudi and Western, particularly U.S. targets in the Gulf.
There were bombings in Kuwait too.
Iran's hand was implicated in the 1983 Kuwait embassy bombings. Those were carried out by operatives of the Iraqi Dawa Party, another Shiite group with long-standing ties to Iran. It showed the blurring lines between these different Iranian-backed cells and militias operating across the region.
Okay, so by 1990, the end of our period, what were the key lessons that had really solidified Iran's proxy doctrine? What did it look like?
Several lessons had shaped it. First, those early successes, especially Hezbollah's dramatic attacks in Beirut in '83, taught them that asymmetrical strikes using proxies could achieve strategic goals like forcing Western military withdrawals that were simply beyond the capability of their own weakened regular military.
So asymmetry worked.
It worked spectacularly well from their perspective. Second, you had this blend. The ideological commitment to resistance against the US, against Israel, against regional rivals merged with the very pragmatic lesson learned from the incredibly costly Iran-Iraq war. Direct conventional conflict with stronger powers was just too costly and risky.
Proxies offered leverage without the same level of risk.
Indirect asymmetrical means avoided those massive risks, but still offered significant leverage and deniability. Third, this led to the embrace, under Khomeini, and then continued seamlessly by Khamenei, of the concept we now call the axis of resistance.
An alliance led by Iran.
Envisioned as an alliance of Iran and its state and non-state allies, united against U.S. and Israeli influence in the region, and Hezbollah was the foundational model for this.
And it became institutionalized within the state.
Very much so. By 1990, the proxy strategy was a core pillar of Iran's grand strategy. The IRGC's Quds force, designed specifically for these external operations, had established dedicated country-specific sections, like the Ramazan Corps focused on Iraq, or a Levant Corps for Lebanon, Syria, and potential operations against Israel. This showed a real long-term commitment to this approach.
And finally, you mentioned flexibility. It wasn't just Shiite groups.
Right. While the primary focus was definitely on cultivating Shiite militias with deep ideological loyalty, Iran showed pragmatic flexibility. They also supported non-Shiite groups, like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and even some Afghan Mujahideen factions, and this is the key, if it served Iran's strategic interests, particularly in confronting the US or Israel.
So the goal was broader than just sectarianism.
Ultimately, yes. The doctrine was about power projection, undermining adversaries, fostering anti-status quo solidarity across the region, using whoever was willing and useful, though Shiite groups remained the core.
So summing up this last part,
Yeah.
by 1990, Iran had fundamentally shifted its approach to statecraft and warfare.
Decisively. Permanently, it seems. The pivot was from direct military confrontation, which was costly and often unsuccessful, to an indirect, proxy-centric approach.
With Hezbollah as the prime example.
The creation and successful early operations of Hezbollah in Lebanon demonstrated the efficacy of cultivating these loyal foreign militias. The doctrine blended revolutionary ideology with pragmatic, irregular tactics, funding militias, establishing covert cells, building influence networks.
Allowing Iran to punch above its weight.
That's a common way to put it, yeah. It allowed Iran to confront regional rivals and global adversaries by proxy, project influence far beyond its borders, and critically minimize direct blowback. This period, 1979 to 1990, it wasn't just chaotic. It actively laid the enduring foundations for what became a hallmark of Iranian statecraft.
A playbook developed then that's still in use today.
Iran entered the 1990s with a well-defined, battle-tested playbook for asymmetrical engagement that has continued to shape conflicts across the Middle East and beyond ever since.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground looking at Iran from 1979 to 1990, really digging into the sources you shared.
And what really emerges when you pull it all together from these sources is this picture of just radical, incredibly rapid transformation.
Yeah, we saw Iran shift from being this monarchy closely aligned with the West, even quietly with Israel,
to a revolutionary Islamic Republic that became profoundly, deeply, ideologically hostile to both.
Re-listening to all this, one key insight that really stands out for me is how Khomeini's ideology wasn't just, a political platform. It was the absolute driving force behind everything.
It permeated everything.
Yeah, his uncompromising anti-Zionist, anti-Western doctrine, it didn't just influence policy, it dictated domestic structure, completely reshaped foreign relations, and defined their whole strategic approach in a way that, well, clearly surprised many outside observers.
Yes, and we've also seen the significant human cost of this transformation.
Definitely.
From the devastating impact on Iran's ancient Jewish community facing persecution, executions, forced emigration, to the violent dismantling of the old power structures like Savak, and that complete abrupt loss of the Israeli intelligence presence that had been built up over decades.
And it was clearly a period of painful, repeated learning for the West, wasn't it? Particularly the US and Israel.
Oh, yes. They initially misread the nature, the depth of the ideology, and just the sheer durability of this new regime.
Leading to significant intelligence failures.
Major failures and miscalculations. Perhaps most starkly revealed by the hostage crisis right at the beginning, and then the incredible complexities and contradictions of the Iran-Contra affair later on. It took the whole decade, really, before a more realistic, albeit pretty grim, consensus about the nature of the regime emerged in the West.
And crucially, this period was where Iran developed these powerful new tools of statecraft.
That strategic use of symbolism wasn't just for show, it was a core part of projecting identity and inspiring support beyond their borders. And as we just discussed, the pioneering and institutionalization of proxy warfare, centered on the IRGC's Quds force and exemplified by Hezbollah, allowed Iran to project power indirectly and exert influence across the region in ways no one had really anticipated.
So pulling it all together, the period from 1979 to 1990 wasn't just some chaotic reactive transition phase.
Not at all.
These sources really show it was the crucible. It was where the enduring foundations were laid for Iran's modern identity, its fundamental regional role, its adversarial relationship with powers like the US and Israel, and its preferred methods of engagement. That proxy strategy that would define its actions for decades to come.
Yeah.
It wasn't just setting the stage, it was building the entire set, designing the play.
That's a good way to put it. The ideological reversal was total. The domestic upheaval had profound human consequences. The misreadings by external powers were costly. And that strategic pivot to asymmetrical warfare fundamentally altered the regional landscape. These weren't separate things. They were all deeply interconnected processes that forged the character of the Islamic Republic and its very challenging interactions with the world ever since.
Which brings us towards the end, and reflecting on everything we've covered, it really leaves us with a question to maybe ponder, doesn't it? Given these profound, deliberate shifts in ideology, alliances, domestic structures, and strategic methods that were forged between 1979 and 1990, and considering how badly external powers initially misread the situation, how much do those early choices, those foundational decisions, and those initial intelligence misreadings continue to shape the complex, often volatile, and deeply entrenched relationships we still witness today in the Middle East and between Iran and the West?
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, how the present is just so deeply rooted in the transformations of the past. You can draw direct lines.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us.
For Iran, the 1980s were the crucible of a new kind of power, one forged not in open battle, but through proxies and plausible deniability. For Israel, it was a decade of reassessment. The ally it lost became the adversary it couldn't predict and could no longer ignore. And for Iranian Jews, it was a final exile, an escape carried out in silence through shadows and with no guarantee of return. What's left behind is a haunting absence, not just of people, but of possibility. Of what might have been, had faith, fear and politics not collided so violently. In the next episode, we ask the machine to look at how that collision reshaped the region itself, through assassinations, cyber strikes, and shadow wars that continue to this day.
Please like and subscribe.